I am so excited for today's conversation with my friend, Juju Chang. Juju's life has been nothing short of incredible, and if it wasn't for her small steps along the way, who knows where she would be. We will dive into an array of topics, including the power of representation, work life balance and self care, and Juju's superpower, leading with compassion. Without further ado, let me introduce you to my friend, Juju Chang. One of the most prominent Asian Americans in broadcast news, Juju Chang is the Emmy Award winning co anchor of ABC News Nightline and a regular contributor to Good Morning America in 2020. With the rise of hate crimes against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, Chang leveraged her platform to become a much admired champion of social change. Chang's highly visible reporting on Asian hate is the culmination of decades of covering everything from natural disasters to terrorism, mass shootings, immigration, violence against the LGBTQIA community, and most recently, the inequities of the COVID-19 pandemic. Known for her in-depth personal narratives and long-form storytelling, Chang has won acclaim for stories with underlying themes of civil and women's rights and social justice. In addition to reporting, Chang has profiled newsmakers like Joe Biden, Oprah Winfrey, and Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg, entertainers such as Tom Hanks, Chris Pratt, and Nicki Minaj, and social media moguls Kendall Jenner and Dude Perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend, Juju Chang. Welcome to Small Steps, Big Change, the podcast where we meet extraordinary people who have used small steps to help create big change. I'm your host, Drew Sullivan. In August of 2020, after years of alcohol and cocaine use, I hit rock bottom. I knew at this moment that I had no choice but to get sober. Through lots of hard work and dedication, I made that a reality. I have to admit, I thought that this would fix everything and that a life filled with happiness would just follow. But sobriety was only the first step for me. I had to be sober before I was ever going to rebuild my life and recover all that was lost. I kept going, focusing on the next right move, or as I call it, the next small step. I then took the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. Every day is a journey for me, and I now believe that I'm in the middle of the most beautiful recovery story of all time. What I have learned is that my story has a lot in common with anyone looking to make big changes in their life. That's why it is time that we work together to make big things happen. Each week on this podcast, I will introduce you to a friend who has used small steps to help create their big change. We are all going through something, and it is my goal that by sharing our stories and bringing vulnerability and empathy to the forefront, we can learn from each other and take the small steps that are needed to create big change. I am so excited for today with my friend. I mean, actually, maybe not more than that for me personally, because I just love her being my friend, but with the incredible Juju Chang, doing so much for so many all the time, changing the world, someone that I believe truly exemplifies everything that this podcast is about and just really focusing on the small moments that lead to that big moment that can really change not only yourself, but others and the way that we think about things around the world and so many different things. So, my friend Juju, how are you?
I'm well. I'm so glad to be with you.
Awesome. I've been looking forward to this. And I know you're visiting family and on vacation, and I know that that is so, so important. So I appreciate this time and just really appreciate everything that you do, as I said, for others, but even just for myself and for me and for so many that get to have the privilege to be on the journey with you. It's really, I think, just wonderful. So, I've seen you speak now, I think 3 times live. I feel like I've been way more than that because I've, watched videos so many times and the work I do for you and for so many others. And, we've had a lot of casual conversations. Your personal story has always stuck with me. Maybe it's the way you say it. Maybe it's because I've heard it so many times. It's just eloquent and it's so inspirational. And you talk about how your family immigrated from South Korea to the United States when you were just 4. What was the catalyst for you guys to come to the US? And just how was it growing up and just the struggle of being different?
I think for my family, there's a lot of complexity that I'm only as an adult really understanding. But I think after the Korean War, my family had been kind of torn apart. And I had a grandfather who was kidnapped and never seen again, that kind of stuff. Very tragic. But we also had these golden opportunities after the 1965 Immigration Act to come to the United States and literally to the land of milk and honey, where prosperity and freedom and democracy were a function of how much hard work and effort you were going to put in. And so my parents came here when I was 4 years old. I had two older siblings, and then they ended up having two more kids here. So we grew up with a family of five in Silicon Valley, where today the roads are paved with money. But back then, it was apricot orchards and cherry orchards and very sort of low key agricultural. And I grew up at a time in Sunnyvale, California, where there weren't a lot of Asian Americans because, again, we were at the tip of the iceberg of the Immigration Act into the United States from Asia and other countries too, but certainly from Korea. And because of that, I just remember growing up and, like so many kids who grew up financially struggling, I didn't realize we were poor. We didn't have a lot. I remember very distinctly my mother like having to return grocery items because we didn't have enough money at the grocery store, right? Stuff like that. I remember thinking that my parents talked funny compared to the other kids. My family's food smelled funny, and that my face to a lot of my peers on the playground looked funny. And I know that every kid gets teased in the playground, but mine, looking back, it felt racialized. I witnessed a lot of prejudice against my dad. I remember watching him be treated poorly and not really having the words to really describe what I was seeing, but just knowing in my gut that it didn't feel right. It felt malicious and wrong. And I think that is the perspective that I honed at a very young age that helped me see the world in a certain way as I went about being a journalist for the last 30 years.
I love that. And I know that idea that it wasn't easy for you, but at the same time, that it seems as if you found the goodness in so many small moments, even when you knew that you were different. You knew that things were not the same for some of the people that you were at school with and many of your friends, but you found the love and you found the happy moments with family and friends. And I think that's fascinating to see. And it seems as if something that's kind of came with you as you are going into your professional world and into the world that you're now in, of just finding the good moments in dark moments. And you talk about your family being in that working class and the struggles that you went through as a child, and that it at times limited your ability to see past that and then just manifest kind of like what would life be for Juju Chang like down the road. And then being an anchor at a major cable network and news network seems like it must have been the farthest thing from your mind, or thinking that it wasn't possible. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the irony is that I've come full circle in many ways. People ask me, when did you know you wanted to be a journalist? And I think I date it back to when I was in middle school and the Iran hostage crisis was underway. That was the birth of the show that I now anchor. It was called Nightline. And back then it was anchored by Ted Koppel. And it came into being after the hostages were freed after day 257, whatever it was. And Nightline started as a America held hostage. And it was like day 54, day 197, day 143. And every night Ted Koppel would come on the air in that sort of voice of God way with the big baritone voice and tell the world what was happening. And in middle school, when the Iran hostages were freed, I jumped on my 10-speed bike and I started riding around the neighborhood like the town crier going, the hostages are free! The hostages are free! The hostages clearly at a time before Twitter. But the bottom line being, I really have this need to tell people what was going on, right? I am the kind of person who bursts into a room and go like, did you hear what happened? Because that's sort of my nature. I'm literally the town crier. And I think that to me is a fundamental part of journalism. I got into journalism because I loved politics. Like I really liked political science and I thought I would want to be a political reporter. But only over time did I really understand and craft my own types of narratives that have to do with what I often refer to as my superpower, which is compassion. I see the world through compassionate eyes. I used to think of it as a deficit, as a weakness, right? So when I was young, I was a nationally ranked swimmer, like really, really young. But that means I swam in the morning, I swam in the afternoon. I was like swimming 6 days a week. And when I quit swimming, I was a teenager. I was like 14, 15 years old. I gained a ton of weight and I was really insecure about myself. I thought I was a complete loser, that I was a has been. I was a former nationally ranked swimmer. And I think that kind of insecurity and self loathing is something that I overcame in a very painful way. Recently, I was reading a book and there's this great quote from Kierkegaard that's quite famous that says, "You can only understand your life looking backward, and yet it has to be lived forward." At the time, as I was living my life forward as a teenager and as a, whatever, I was so insecure and I thought that was so awful. And now looking back, I realize that's my superpower. That's what made me the kind of journalist that I am. It allowed me to be a compassionate storyteller. It allowed me to engage with people in an open hearted way that I think that's my superpower. I am able to get people to trust me and tell me their life story or their story generically, unfiltered, right? Without a lot of defense or pretense, because that's how I approach people. And I think that's what makes for good storytelling. And I think because people, just to put it in complete layman's terms, I am real with people and people are real with me. And that makes for good storytelling. And so I think that that, again, is something that I only realize now looking back.
Totally. Totally. And you talk also, and it's so interesting because one thing that I've learned representing journalists in the space of speaking is that though you're all similar, you report on the news, right? Or you share stories around certain things, you're all so different. I talk a lot about Steve Pemberton, who's a speaker of ours and a writer, and he wrote a book called The Lighthouse Effect. And it's all about how we have lighthouses in our lives that help guide us. And they're normally people, but they're people that you don't always know are there, but that you're looking to for support or guidance. But then there's also really intentional people that function the same way. And you had those types of people like Connie Chung and George Takai and people that were kind of like your representation lighthouses.
Yeah.
As you say, you look back at your life and kind of when you could pull out that, oh gosh, that insecurity I had is actually my superpower and something that I rely on that's helped me build a career. Do you also look back on your life and say to yourself, oh, wow, I never realized how important that person was for me? And if so, like, who are those people? Do you have a few examples of people that have been that constant influence?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that that would be Connie Chung, because at the time there were so few journalists of color that I could look to. And I remember it was actually my mother who said to me, that Connie Chung, she talks a lot and she talks about current events a lot and she's Asian and you could do that. That's literally how basic it was. And I looked up at Connie Chung and I thought, you know what? She's right. I could do something like that. I had won a bunch of speaking contests in high school. And so that's what I mean about you talk a lot. Like I was good at public speaking, and that was something that I did as a student leader. And that was what helped her help me find my North Star, right? And my North Star was somebody who was in an industry that it didn't even occur to me that I could do. And I say this a lot when I give talks. Andrew, you may have heard me say this, but I genuinely think that the idea of a role model, the idea of representation, when we say representation matters, when you see somebody who looks like you doing something that you could only dream of doing, it gives you permission to dream. That is the power of that kind of North Star. And I think you said George Takei, and he is really an example of somebody who, for generations, showed not just that you could be an Asian American in Hollywood or an Asian American star in a TV series, but also that that vision of the future included an African American on the bridge, included an Asian American on the bridge, on the management team. And that was part of what was so beautiful to me about seeing George in Star Trek. I was a huge Star Trek fan, so I'm clearly showing my age and my nerdiness, but it's so funny. I have a physics major for a son now, and he starts talking about physics, and my eyes start to cross, and I'm like, is that when the Klingons declared war again? I have no idea what you're talking about.
I love that. And it's a good segue because I really want to ask you and I want to talk about this because I feel like I've only had a couple moments where I feel like I've heard you talk about Juju the mom and really Juju the family person. And, I think that obviously in the work you do and just, how powerful your story is and how powerful then your storytelling is in the work that you do. Tell us a little bit about who Juju the mom is, the wife, the sister, the daughter. Is it the same Juju?
It's the absolute same Juju. When my kids were much younger, every time I put on makeup, they would be upset because they knew that that meant I was going to work. Because I'm super sweatpants and low key at home. I think for me, again, like Kierkegaard said, when I look back on my life now and I'm like, my kids are, two of them are heading to college this fall, and the third one is bringing up the rear in high school already. I look back on my raising them and being a wife and a mom, and I'm as proud. Actually, I'm probably more proud of the energy and the focus and the time that I invested in that area of my life, right? I mean, we talk so sort of strategically about how we invest our time and how we do this and how we do that in the office space, but we don't really do it in the home space. And I had the luck of meeting a nice Jewish guy when I was just out of college. His name's Neil Shapiro, and he too was in television and still is actually. He's head of public television in New York. And we fell madly in love, and we dated for 7 years before we got married. And then we waited another half dozen years before we had kids. And yet all these years later, I look at my partnership with my husband as a life partnership. I often say to young working women, I used to say that Neil was a great spouse because he was in television. He understood the demands of my television career. And so he's always been very supportive of the travel and the time and the late nights and the early mornings and the crazy weekend shoots and stuff that pops up and things I cancel all the time. And then I realized 20 some odd years into our relationship, actually, even if Neil were a dentist, he would be this supportive because that is who he is as a human, right? So I say that to young women all the time, like, find a guy who is supportive of you. I don't like any of these guys who are like, why do you have to work late? Why do you have to do that? If you are doing something, whatever it is, if it's knitting a sweater or cooking a meal or going to work, your spouse should be supportive of you, right? And when it comes to being a mom, I'm like really into being a fun mom. I'm about being present and doing active things all the time. So in the winter, we ice skate or go skiing. And in the summer, we're outdoors and whatever. I'm really about being active. And the kids and I have spent a lot of time camping and on rivers and lakes and oceans because we really enjoy that kind of time together. Except 3 boys, they're very active. So it's great fun. But I also think day to day basis, I was constantly doing the calculation of where do I put my priorities today? Right? Do I put my priority in my job? Do I put my priority in my son who needs something? Do I go to the school open house or do I do that shoot in the New Jersey? Do I make it to the last baseball game of the year or do I do that interview with so and so? And like that kind of calculus is a day to day juggling act. I used to say it's not like juggling. It's like, those acrobats who like spin plates in the air. That's how I
Yeah.
felt like my raising my kids was like. I always had plates spinning. And the big thing that I say to my working moms a lot is you have to learn and really value the idea of good enough. It's good enough. You don't have to be perfect, right? And that's the same with the office. Like, you know what? We've done this project. We've made the deadline. It's good enough. It's not perfect. I could stay till 4 in the morning and make it perfect, or I could go home and spend a little time with my kids right now. It's good enough, right? And the same with the kids. Like, I don't have to make it to every single baseball game. It's good enough. And they know that if I could be there, I would. And it's actually the value of having 3 kids because there was one year when I had 3 kids playing baseball in 3 different boroughs of Manhattan and New Jersey, right? And I literally physically could not be me and my husband There's only two of us and there were three games. It was literally impossible for us to make all three games. And so at one point, I sat them all down. I said, listen, you play baseball for you. You don't play baseball for me or for your dad. And so while we would love to be there, and you know that if I could be there, I would be there, but I can't make it to every game. And they're like, that's fine. And then there was like 1 year that I was considered the bad luck charm. Every time I showed up, they lost. They didn't want me at the games, which was hilarious. They're like, just drop off the sandwiches and leave, Juju. Go ahead. Go ahead. So,
That is
you know,
funny.
parenting is a contact sport, and it took as much energy and as much focus and as much research as any other story I've done in my entire life. But in life, I say to my kids, you will find that the more energy you put into something, the more rewarding it is. The harder something is, the more rewarding that activity is. And that is definitely holds true with parenting, because I've never done anything in my life that has taxed every single aspect of my being, right? From the birthing them to the sleep deprivation of feeding them to raising them to trying to outsmart them psychologically for 15 years. And yet there's nothing more rewarding in life.
Totally. And I mean, it's just fascinating to me how I find that the way that you determined what's my next right move as a mom, and is that doing that interview, is that going to that conference? It's so directly aligns with kind of like, what's that next step of sobriety? What's that next step? Am I going to make that decision? Am I going to not make that decision? Am I going to put myself in this place, or am I going to serve this part of my life? It's truly how, like, if you look too deep and you're like, this 6 months, I'm going to do as much as I can for this child. It's really daunting because you're like, okay, how am I going to do that? How am I going to navigate that through this interview that could pop up, and, hosting 2 days a week or 3 days a week or off this week on next week? Like, how do you manage the responsibilities of knowing that things in that child's life could change, things in my work could change? And if I'm going to make this long-term goal, how do you manage both of them potentially changing and still hit that goal? But yet when you focus on it day to day and you make those conscious decisions day to day, well, then those days turn into weeks, weeks into months. And then you're in that place where you're like, wow, because I focused on it day to day, now I look back at those days and I say to myself, I made those decisions and now look at how far we've come. And I think that the main reason why I think I even started this podcast is knowing that some of the steps I took to be a better person for me and to live more of who I am as a person, it translates into just so much of how you break down these big daunting challenges that are in front of us. Some of them are more traditional, like being a parent and managing career and doing that. And others are more, maybe more daunting for some, but maybe a little more different as well. And yet the way that you get through them is similar and the same. And one thing is that I like too, is that you talk a lot about your own parents, especially when you're, sharing that story of your upbringing. And you gave a speech last fall, and I'm quoting from it. You said, I think my parents tried to arm us with what they thought we needed to make our way in the world. They gave each of us their most precious gems, pride in their Korean heritage, their work ethic. They showed us every day by example that the key to life involved hard work, and that life begins and ends with family. These core values were stitched into the fabric of our childhoods, wrapped tightly around us to help us make our way in the world, which, gives me goosebumps reading, gives me goosebumps when I heard it, because so eloquent again, but also so real. And it seems these qualities and the lessons have clearly stayed with you through your journalism work and your work as a mom. Have you continued this with your own sons, and have you innovated that approach? Like, have you added your own twist to it, but have you been able to kind of even parent in that same way of really just putting all of that at the forefront?
I think that I have taught my children the same kind of calculus that I do every day, right? And I explain to them explicitly, but also by demonstrating time and time again that I value them and I value family ahead of anything else. And I think they recognize that. But that said, they, like their father, understand the value of supporting people. So if I say to them, oh my goodness, I'm going to miss your fill in the blank, I'm going to miss your last day of school because I have to be in Honduras to do that story, my kid's answer is always, well, of course, we understand. It's okay, mama. I know da, da, da. So that kind of give and take is very precious. But the thing that I am trying really hard to calibrate with my kids is I think that both my husband and I are a little bit workaholics. I think we work a little too hard. And I really think that the pandemic has taught all of us that life is fleeting, life is short, and you can ask for flexibility in your workspace. And you can ask for room. And so I'm trying to bring that into my own life, right? I mean, I've shared with you, Drew, that my mom is going through a transition, right? And I'm trying really hard to be present for her as well. So add that into the bag of things that I'm carrying around. And I think I realized that it's important to value all of those things, even if it makes you step away from your work commitments a little bit. And that's okay. And I think that's again that what I'm trying to teach my kids, like, especially when you're young and just starting out, you guys have to like work really, 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 really hard. And that's the work ethic that my parents taught me. But I think what my parents never really did was slow down and smell the roses because they were hardworking immigrants. And that never really occurred to them until much, 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 much later in their lives. Whereas I feel like I'm at, in many ways, the height of my career. And yet I'm still trying really hard to say, here are the boundaries. I'm going to take this time away for my family. I'm going to take this time away for myself. And that's the kind of messaging that I'm trying to send to my kids.
I love that because I feel like you also, well, you said it to me. I mean, because we have these fluid conversations all the time where like I feel like I'm privileged to kind of hear you even talk out that schedule, right? And talk
Right, right. You and I are constantly saying, like, I have to be there and I want to try to be there and I want to split myself in two and be in three places.
and it's fascinating to see, because in those moments I say to myself, okay, we're just trying to find a solution. But it's so inspiring to know that not only are you thinking about how can I fit this in, but you're also thinking about like, what is going to make the most impact? What is going to serve not just me, but those around me the best? And like, what is the right move for what is important? Not just the right move for what's going to work the best or what's going to make everyone the most happy or what's going to bring the most amount of money or what's going to bring the most amount of praise. It's more like what is going to be the right decision to not just serve others or the person that you're thinking of, but also yourself. It seems like you've
Right.
gotten to a place where you really have harnessed what is that part of you that needs to be with it for it to feel good and for you to be the best version of yourself.
Totally. And I feel like you and I have these conversations looped into logistical calls, and yet we're constantly catching up on each other's lives and trying to figure out what our goals are. But I do think that you at APB have this ability to embed really important issues, right, into your work life, right? You're addressing all sorts of equity issues, you're addressing identity issues and cultural issues and stuff that's embedded in your work life. Not many people have that. Most people are like out there trying to make a buck, right? And so for me and for my kids, as they're just starting looking at what are my career options down the road? How am I going to make my way in the world? I really have done the same thing that my parents did for me was really give them a sense of pride in their identity, that means something. And they are very strongly Jewish and Asian American, and they identify strongly in both of those realms. And they take those issues very seriously. Our second son, Travis, is working for the Jewish Federation for refugee relief. And it's just a summer job for a summer internship, but it's the kind of stuff that he feels is meaningful. And yet, my older son, I think, also has a great deal of pride and sense of identity, and he carries that in a different way as he's navigating the world.
Totally. My life over the past couple of years through sobriety and now in recovery has changed so much. And I feel like so many people say to me, like, oh, you're so grounded. And then they're like, how do you have that, like ability? And for me, it's a lot around like the consciousness work that I do for myself. And a lot of that is rooted in like spiritual practice, for me at least. And for a long time, like I didn't really think that you could be spiritual. And again, this is maybe like my Irish Catholic guilt coming out now, but like I didn't feel as if you could be spiritual without being religious, and I think a lot of people confuse the two. I know you're religious, but knowing that they are a little different, and that there are, ways to be spiritual without it being attached to a certain religion. Like, do you have a spiritual practice which really give back to yourself and take care of yourself?
Absolutely. And it's interesting. So my spirituality is grounded in two parts of my world. One is in Judaism, obviously. I was raised as an atheist. There is no God. I was a secular humanist growing up, but I was always kind of searching and agnostic. And when I converted to Judaism, I made a conscious effort, or a conscious choice, I should say, to believe that there's a higher being that is bigger than me. And I kind of left it at that. But on my mother's side, she's a Buddhist, a devout Buddhist. And I started reading about meditation and spirituality. I had a nephew who went through a sobriety journey that was very topsy turvy. And he used meditation to help him reach a more stable sense of sobriety. And he and I had shared what his meditation practice was. And my mom came at it from a Buddhist perspective. And they did the same kinds of things. It was a kind of a visualization. I've now turned to a guided meditation through my co-anchor, Dan Harris, who wrote the book 10% Happier. He has and this is not an ad, but he has a great app called 10% Happier. And I do guided meditation, which is like compassion and loving kindness meditation. My mother does this, where she meditates, visualizes each of her grandchildren. She has 13 of them. And she starts by sending loving kindness out to each of her grandchildren. And I do a guided meditation by a guru named Sharon Salzberg. But she begins her compassionate meditation by sending loving kindness to herself. Self love is where you start, because you cannot give others loving kindness unless you are loving and kind to yourself. And let's face it, who is meaner to us than ourselves? Who's more critical, who hates ourselves more than ourselves? Nobody. So the minute you calm that self-criticism down, it's such a wonderful place to start. And so you start by meditating and being kind to yourself, like you're okay. Stop beating yourself up. You're going to be safe. You're going to be all right. And then you start sending that loving kindness out in whatever direction you want it to be, whether it's your dog or the next door neighbor or your family or your lover or whomever. There is something about that kind of practice of gratitude, essentially, that I think is incredibly grounding and helpful. So that to me it floats in the realm of spirituality, but it really has roots in a kind of Buddhist practice of meditation.
I love that. Yeah, I have a daily gratitude practice. It's like I can't start my day without it. And it's not always the same, as you said, right? Like sometimes there's different ways to trigger it. I mean, like yesterday I was writing thank you cards that like I knew I had to write, but like it was my way of saying thank you. Obviously, that was a lot more of a direct gratitude practice. But then other days it's truly sometimes whether it's time or whether it's energy or whether it's just because I can't get that thing I got to do when I get to work out of my head. It's just a really intentional, direct thank you for being sober. And sometimes for me, that is good enough. There's other days that I need to not even think about substance and I need to think about other parts of what my life is at this point. And I really have to dig deep for those moments because sometimes it's not as easy. But I really do. And I'm grateful that you share that because it's the truth. And I think that when you don't have that consciousness and that mindfulness practice, it's very difficult to see during the hustle and bustle, especially in the work you do, the work I do, the work many people that I feel that will be listening to this and others that I've had on do, it's so easy to forget about those little things. The same way that if you're mean to someone, how do you move on with that person? Will you apologize to that person? So if you're mean to yourself, how do you move on? Well, you need to apologize. And if you don't, and if you don't give back to yourself for doing that and for saying that or for being so hard on yourself, which we're naturally doing as human beings, and you don't give back to yourself to say, oh, it's okay you did that, or it's okay you have tomorrow. I mean, Glennon Doyle always says, and I love it, that she says like she quits every day. 6
Ah,
o'clock, 30. She's like, I quit. And then the next day she wakes up and she's like, all right, I got my job again. But when you've gotten to that point of your day or your week, it's okay to say, all right, the book is shut and tomorrow I'm going to open it again to read. And that there's nothing wrong with that. And then there's nothing wrong to take what you need to do to give to yourself so that you can have that energy to give to others. And I love that. One specific part of this podcast, but also I think it's just how do we transfer over, like, what is our personal narrative and what are we living internally? And then how do we bring that externally? And I think that an easy word to say that is how are we leading our lives, but also how are we leading others and leadership in general? And Simon Sinek says that two things create a great leader, and they're often forgotten, and that's the empathy and just perspective. And he goes on to say that leaders tend to think that they need to be in charge, but they forget sometimes that they're leading a charge or that they are like moving a charge forward. And I think the same is true when you specifically look at journalists. Like there's so many people that feel like, oh, I'm Juju Chang. And like that's more important than them telling the story that they just told, is like that recap of them being there. And I think that you have this really, really, really unique, you called it compassion. I mean, empathy, compassion, very similar. And it's the way in which you tell stories, you ask questions. Have you always been this way? Or is it something that you think has like evolved over time, this idea of compassion, empathy, kindness?
It's such a good question. I was thinking about this the other day. I like to think so. And I will say this: I have encountered people who've known me from way back when who say, Juju, you somehow managed to stay above the office politics. You put your head down and did your work and let your work speak for yourself. You weren't like, sucking up to that guy and getting in good with that guy. And I wasn't playing those kinds of games early on. And I've been praised for that. And now, again, looking back, I've had older people say to me, you've always been known as somebody whose reputation is being the nice one. And so I take a lot of pride in that, right? And that wasn't an overnight thing. It wasn't a one day thing. But I will say one last thing that really stuck with me when I interviewed Tom Hanks and Mrs. Rogers, Fred Rogers' widow, right? And Tom Hanks was playing Mr. Rogers in a Hollywood movie. And the director was also there too. I ended up interviewing the director as well. And the director and Mrs. Rogers told me that Mrs. Rogers had a conversation with the director and was adamant that they put in Mr. Rogers' flaws, right? His anger, his perfectionism, because for him, being nice was a daily practice, right? And for him, he was not a saint. And Mrs. Rogers said, and this verbiage makes it into the movie because she had this conversation with the director. She said, Mr. Rogers was not a saint. And you don't have to be a saint to be nice and to be kind, because those are conscious choices and those are actions that you live every day. But if only saints can be nice, then that lets everybody else off the hook because I'm not a saint, right? And so only when we reinforce the normalization of the acts of kindness that daily make up somebody to be nice, I think it is almost too easy to say, oh, were you always a nice person? I was like, I like to think that I was, but really what I like to think is that I worked at it. I made a conscious effort to be kind. I made a conscious effort to be nice. Trust me, I'm not trying to compare myself to Mr. Rogers. I'm not, but I'm just saying that sort of act of kindness, of being the nice guy, is something that everyone can work towards.
Yeah, like our friend Orion, right? Like who we met in Orlando, who like that's why he was Time Kid of the Year, was because of his kindness campaign and how like, even at a young age, he still has to work at that. Nothing is like built into you. I mean, it's the same way that you're mean. It's the same way that you're racist. People even say, oh, you're boring with alcoholism or addiction. It's like, okay, I know it runs in the family. I know that there are commonalities among the way in which my uncle, my aunt, other people from generations prior to that maybe used substance the way I did. But I also know for certain, just the way that my dad, as it's more on his side of the family, talks about his upbringing, there's nothing that's comparable from the way I was raised and what I had and the privilege I had and the vacations I went on and the support I had compared to my dad's life. His dad died when he was 17. His mom died at a pretty young age as well. And it's people on his side of the family that have these same issues that I do, right? And so I look at it and I say like, okay, well, you can't say that I've been kind forever or it's because of this that they've always had that. It's like anything, you do work at it. The same way you work at bad things, you work at good things.
Totally right. Being bad can become a habit. Being good can become a habit.
Exactly. And neither one of them is a sentence. Like neither one of them is a prison sentence, I guess you could say, of who you have to be, who
Exactly.
you're going to be. I think that's totally, totally fascinating. And when you break it down, really simple to see. One thing that I can't imagine is ever easy, but I guess based on that practice, it's probably where you're tested the most. And it's probably not around the people that you're interviewing per se, but around the context that you have to. Seems to me that, and I'm sure it's just because of this, that ABC tends to send you to some of the most difficult, hardest, biggest, most horrendous tragedies that the country sees and just tough situations. How do you do it? It's the most taxing thing, and it's, school shooting and this situation and that situation. And there's clearly, I'm sure it goes to the compassion and the empathy that there's that reasoning behind it. But I guess it's the answer of maybe why they send you, but how do you do it? I can't even begin to think about that.
It's an interesting question, and I've answered that question in a lot of different ways, both to other people and to myself. I mean, obviously, the way that I do it functionally is that I compartmentalize, right? Like when I'm on deadline and I'm on a breaking news story, I push the emotion out. I push the, other stuff out and I just go on instinct on some level. But I think in another sense, it makes me feel useful, which to me, it's an antidote to darkness, right? So, for example, during the pandemic, where a lot of people felt helpless, they felt like there's nothing they could do. I felt like I could do the journalism and that I was doing something. And in fact, it is a lot of what mental health experts say, people who are suffering from depression or anxiety or whatever, that is an antidote to feel like they're doing something meaningful, right? Whether it's handing out food at a pantry or helping a local homeless organization, or that when you feel like you're doing something of service or helping the community or helping a family or helping your family or helping whatever, that meaningful contribution can help lift depression and make you understand that the world is bigger than just your problems. And so from a larger philosophical perspective, that's part of how I do it. And then lastly, I think when I go about and execute on these stories, I love to tell the story of the shooting in Vegas where, I interviewed somebody who was shot in the hip and didn't even realize it, had run for a quarter of a mile with a bullet lodged in her hip. And she said, when I realized I had been shot, I fell to the ground immediately. And all of a sudden, an off duty firefighter who she didn't realize who he was, complete stranger comes over and starts shielding her from the bullets and administering first aid. Somebody else comes out with one of those concert barricades and turns it into a stretcher and takes her out to, a waiting car that was volunteering to take cars to the hospital. And the next day I'm interviewing this woman in the hospital, and the hospital workers are saying, I've never seen anything like it. There were like dozens and dozens and dozens of just cars converted into ambulances, taking complete strangers to the hospital. And as I was interviewing the woman who'd been shot in the hip, she said, you know what I saw on that night when that darkness descended on that concert ground? She said, I saw one bad man in the tower and I saw hundreds of heroes here on the ground. And so to me, telling those kinds of stories, bearing witness to that kind of story helps me restore my faith in humanity, even in the darkest, ugliest times, because that was a really dark shooting. A lot of people died and it was depressing, and there was no political action after that occurred. There was no learning that occurred. And it really, there's a lot of room for despair, but I try to hold fast to the points of light, right? As we talk about the daily points of light that keep hope burning.
Totally. I think you actually said this to me. A good journalist knows what the person's going to answer when you ask a question, right? Like that's why you're doing that. I obviously, I didn't know what you would say there, but translates actually kind of to how I feel about my job, right? Like, I mean, I'm never going to be an Asian woman. I'm never going to be a Black man. I'm never going to be a trans person. But knowing that I am helping them tell their story and being able to take, I can hear all of the noise around hearing about this unarmed Black or brown young boy being shot by a police officer, or hearing about the mass shooting, or hearing about the hate that we see between the political divide. And it makes me angry, of course. It makes me sad. Like, I'm sure a lot of these stories make you angry, they make you sad. And there are times you're like, all you want to do is scream. But when you can see the light in the story, and when you can see that among all of the noise and among all of the terrible, there are people or groups or organizations or moments that are showing you how the world should be.
What I would add to that, Drew, is that you're an ally. You are a true ally in the sense that as a gay man, you know what it's like to feel other and to be marginalized and to be discriminated against and to have hate directed at you for no good reason and to be dehumanized in that way. And I think that's what I felt growing up and understood and recognized and decided to not look away and decided not to ignore that. And so I want to be an ally as a journalist, right? And tell stories of people who are, it's literally just like one story leads to the next story leads to the next story. I did one story about Gigi Gorgeous, the trans YouTube person that led to another story with Chelsea Manning, which led to another story. And suddenly I have this body of work that has won 2 GLAAD awards and all sorts of whatever, been asked to speak at Gay Lesbian Journalists Association this summer. And I've done multiple times in the past. And I'm seen as an ally, right? I feel I'm an ally to other communities of color who go through similar persecution. And as a Jew and as an Asian woman and as a woman, I feel like I know what that feels like from a variety of perspectives, right? When anti-Semitism hits, it hits hard for my community. And when anti-Asian hate hits, that hits hard to my community. But I can bring my lived experience into that storytelling. And now I have a body of work that allows me to be an ally in so many other realms as well. And I think that you, Drew, are a true ally and you stand in allyship with so many communities as well. That's what solidarity is all about. That's what this kind of storytelling is all about. It humanizes, different communities, different individuals within that community. You see that not every queer experience is the same. Not every Asian American experience is the same. Not every Jewish American experience is the same. And that's why representation matters, because there's so many different iterations of each of those people. And by telling these stories, we're humanizing people. Like that was the big breakthrough in some of these TV shows that featured African American, like I interviewed Shonda Rhimes, right? And she was talking about how her characters weren't Black doctors. They were just doctors who happened to be Black. And it allowed a lot of these conversations around race and equity to be sort of embedded into a natural narrative. And I think that is the power of storytelling in many ways.
Totally. And it's interesting. And I remember having this conversation when it's kind of the way I work. I think sometimes people are receptive, others aren't. And I'm always so grateful that you were when, I said we had been working with you for years, just more on like an individualized level, or I guess a case by case basis. And then we started working together closer, and we already talked about family and we already talked about your career. And I think all of those played into you, limiting the amount of external events you did. And it was never because you didn't want to. And I think it was just, it was because of circumstance. But interesting enough is like when that circumstance became, and I just think this is how like there's so many, when we talk about higher beings and just that you're called to do things at certain times and that you should never question the timing of things, because when the right thing comes to you and it's at a certain time, that is the right time. And I think for you, you saw a little bit, if you could ever carve out a small path of availability, you saw it, you saw that glimpse. And right around that same time is when the whole world started to see in front of their eyes the rise in violence against the AAPI community, anti-Asian bias, anti-Asian hate. And it was kind of that whisper to you that was like, yeah, Juju, you thought that you had this time to do this, but now I'm like like it's kind of like the universe saying to you, like, yes, you have the time to talk about this. And
Now's the time to talk, baby.
yeah. And so, you have all these experiences of lending your journalistic abilities, your empathy, your compassion to be able to have really great conversations with people and really even probably find ways to build them up in those moments, not just the impact that the story tells to everyone else in the world, but even the individual people you're interviewing and that you're working with, you tend to see that they probably turn the corner during those moments. How has that been different when you're talking to people within the AAPI community over the past year or two, where you've had to have some really hard conversations around the murders in Atlanta at the spa shootings and just the rise in violence that I think we saw a lot in New York City? based on the fact that people have their cell phones out all the time and got to show people those moments. Did your journalism change because you had such a direct connection with the person that you were talking to?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a number of things happened, and this is just like referring back to our conversation earlier. Like my priorities started to change. I had one kid in college, another almost in college, and a third, like basically adolescent. And so my parenting constraints changed. And then at the same time, this rise in AAPI hate made that a bigger priority for me. In the past, I had always done community and cultural events sort of as a side hustle, just for fun and usually for nonprofits and whatever. But all of that work that I had done, including helping found a pretty sizable foundation called the Korean American Community Foundation, and we've given out millions of dollars in grants to the Korean American community, which kept me very front and center in understanding the plight of more recent immigrants, right? So, like, I've reached a certain socioeconomic status where so much of being Asian American doesn't affect me so much because I'm privileged. But by helping found this community organization, I was very much in touch with and aware of how invisible the rest of my community is, right? These are the folks who deliver Chinese food dinners to your door, or who paint your nails in the salon, or who do your laundry on the weekends, or who do the dirty work a lot unseen, right? The undocumented, the uninsured, the folks who are invisible literally because so much of the perception of Asian Americans is that we're crazy rich Asians and whatever. And so for me, all of that kind of culminated at a moment with the AAPI hate, with the pandemic, where, and again, the third thing that clicked into place, or the fifth thing that clicked into place, was that so much of it was on Zoom. So I didn't have to fly away for a day and a half to deliver a message to a very important group. And so, Drew, you were able to connect me with colleges, with young people's minds, to middle schoolers, to healthcare organizations, to corporate leaders, and allowed me to share my 30 years of experience at a time that I think it was really important. And so not only did my priorities and my life change, but the circumstances around it, just how quickly and how easily hate can be weaponized against a community that 3 years ago, no one was trying to beat up Asian people on the street. And then suddenly a pandemic hits and we're your scapegoat. We're the ones who've like wreaked havoc on your lives. Like it made no sense. And then it sort of reinforces this idea that it's disordered people. Often there's an intersection of homelessness and mental illness that is at the crux of all this. And so, what is it about the subconscious, the unconscious biases that we hold against Asian Americans? What is it about the dog whistles, whatever community it is that can be activated, that can trigger hate? We're talking about it right now. Like there's violence against an FBI office in Cincinnati. Why? Because there have been dog whistles that have been blown to signal that the January 6th, the QAnon conspiracy, the things that these messages that are sent out, why is it the white supremacist groups are attacking LGBTQ parades? Like what in the world is happening? We need to be able to connect those dots of how hate gets weaponized in our society and how quickly any of these groups can be targeted. That's why these groups should stand in solidarity, because at any given day, this hate can be weaponized against any one of these groups.
Totally. I think it seems as if it's kind of been, and I've talked about this, where like you could never predict it, and you wouldn't want to predict it because it would mean that you would have been predicting violence against your own community. But it's also that moment around being called to be that voice. And it doesn't have to be, that journalist that, has done years and years of work and the whole world knows, and that person of influence. It could be in your community. It could be in your household. It could be, just the way in which you work in your own office, but that responsibility to do something about something could be called on you at any moment based on who you are and what you've done in the past, or what you bring to the table. And so, my final question for you before I just wrap up with our takeaway 10 that I like to do is, I liked this question. It seems cliche, but I liked it when I heard you ask it to someone last month when we were actually at an event together, when you said, what's your moonshot? What's your goal? And I say that not just from a Juju lens of what's your next step or your next kind of thought process, but like, what's your moonshot around the inequities we see in the world, the hate, the lack of kindness, the divide?
I think for me, boy, I don't know if it's a personal moonshot or a prayer I have for our society, which is that we can turn the volume down on so much of the heated rhetoric and the hateful communication that happens on a day-to-day basis. And that sounds very Mr. Rogers. And maybe it's because I've been talking about Mr. Rogers in this hour, but I genuinely hope for my children's sake and for my future grandchildren's sake that we can somehow turn the temperature down on our public discourse to remind ourselves that it's not okay to use the language with each other that top officials are using, right? That kind of dehumanizing language has consequences, and that I want our society to understand that and to be able to turn that temperature down because it has proven itself time and time again to be dangerous, to be deadly, and to be something that we need to learn from and improve on rather than ignore it and make it be like, oh, that's the way it was. I try to explain to young people that, political discourse wasn't like this before. We didn't address each other in this way. And I think that I want us to go back to a time where it's not okay to be racist, where it's not okay to call people names who you disagree with. One of the things that it's ironic is I think that shame, especially in the world of addiction, but even in any kind of other psychological realm, shame is really debilitating and toxic and corrosive. And in many ways, I want to do away with that kind of shame. But on another level, I want to return to a time where people were ashamed of saying hateful things. And that is one area where I want the shame to return. Like, you should be ashamed of yourself for being publicly racist. You should be ashamed of yourself for hating on people that you've never met who you don't know. You should be ashamed of that kind of behavior. So again, I think it's ironic because I want to do away with shame in so many ways, but I want to bring it back in others.
Totally. So my last part is 10 questions. They're simple, but I ask every guest the same 10 questions.
Okay, I'm ready.
My way 10. What makes you laugh?
Will Ferrell.
What? If you could ask one person one question, what would it be and who would you ask?
My spirit animal is Oprah. So I would like to ask her how she's able to communicate so brilliantly all the time. I admire the way she does it. So how do you do it, basically? Although I've interviewed Oprah on multiple occasions, and you'd think I would have asked the question myself, but I didn't because I was too shy.
Well, it's not my time to say this because it's supposed to be questions for you, but many people may ask you that same question.
Oh, you're sweet to
I
say.
want you to
Thank
know that. Thinking about the workplace and young people, especially people that have been working at home for a couple of years, but people that are going into the workplace now, what is your advice for young people entering the workplace?
Don't be afraid to lean into your identity, but also just remember that there's no work that's beneath you.
I love that. How should we measure our lives in years, in moments, and accomplishments?
In the people who we love and the people who love us. That's how we should measure our lives.
I love that. Name one thing about yourself that will never change.
Such a good question. One thing about me that will never change, my love of karaoke and my lack of karaoke ability.
I love that. That's so good. My partner hates karaoke too. He's he's in musical theater, went to school for voice and musical theater, and still hates karaoke. So you have that in common.
That's amazing.
If you could, would you really want to live a life that was free of challenges and obstacles?
No, I wouldn't. I've had a lot of challenges and obstacles, and I think they've shaped me for sure.
I love that. Which three people, past or present, would you invite to a dinner party?
Ooh, which three people, past or present, would you invite to a dinner party? I would love to meet Frederick Douglass. I've recently been reading some of his stuff, especially his solidarity with Asian American folks. He's just such a phenomenal human story. Somebody who could go from enslaved to brilliant scholar and writer is just like, how, who are you? I want to meet you. So Frederick Douglass. I would love to meet my great grandfather, and I've been looking into his history, and he was really a nobleman in the true sense. And there's so much about him in my family that's full of folklore. So I would love to meet him. And then I guess it would have to be Oprah because she's my spirit animal. So that would be my third.
Wow, that would be a great dinner. I mean,
Oh
Oprah,
my God. It would be,
your great grandfather, and you.
yeah, it would be awesome. It would be
I
serious.
love that.
Yeah, yeah.
I love that. How do you define a community, and are you part of one?
Oh my God, yes. I'm a part of many communities. I think communities are built with shared values and action. So I feel like my family is a community because we have shared values and we do stuff together, fun stuff usually, but also hard stuff, right? I'm involved in my synagogue community and I would say we have shared values and we do stuff together. And my colleagues are a community. We have shared values for sure, shared journalistic qualities, and we do lots of stuff together. So it's action and shared values. And I belong to many communities.
I love that. Have you ever looked in the mirror and not recognized the person staring back?
Yeah. I mean, aging is not ezy, I have to say. There are times when I look in the mirror and I'm like, where did that gray hair come from? Who is that? What are those wrinkles? What the heck? And 'cause in
Leave.
my heart, I'm still that 25-year-old whippersnapper. And trust me, that is not what my driver's license says anymore. So yeah, there are times when that happens where I'm like, wow, I'm a middle-aged lady and I'm okay with it. But it's definitely like, who are you?
Ugh. What are you grateful for in this moment?
Family. I mean, I'm sitting in a beautiful lakefront property that does not belong to me, but one of my family members, and we are gathering as a community and enjoying each other and enjoying this beauty and the bounty that we are so grateful for.
Thank you so much. You mean so much to me. I always say this, I don't know if I said it during the conversation, but when we talk about lighthouses and people that help guide you, I mean, even I feel like many people have been positive for me during my journey over the past couple of years, especially. But I think I know when I look back, at my career, that my time with you will be defining for me and just what I've learned and the way in which I carry myself and just your vision and just so much about you and not even knowing now I know a lot more about you and your family, but even just the way in which you speak of your family and your husband. And there's just so much goodness. I think Byron says that your co-anchor in a video that he narrated for you. And he's like, where there's goodness, there's Juju. And
No.
it really is what it is. And I appreciate you sharing the time and the space. And I know that your story and the way that you've used your small steps and those micro decisions to be able to create that big change and really help so many is such a gift. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so glad to spend time with you always, Drew. And I feel the same way about you. So, mwah.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Small Steps, Big Change podcast. I hope that this episode inspired you to let go of whatever is holding you back and take the first small step. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, follow our YouTube channel, the Small Steps, Big Change podcast, and connect with me on Instagram. Remember, no matter what you are going through, without taking small steps, you are limiting your potential to create big change. So take that first small step today. I promise you that you won't regret it.